We're here with two of the three Democratic candidates in the 10th Congressional District. We thank you for joining us today. We would like to start out with a couple of questions that we ask each of the candidates in each of the races. Just get them out of the way at the beginning. The first question is, have you ever been arrested before? We'll start with you, Mr. Modarres.
No, I have not, and also I'm an attorney, so I've underwent an extensive background check in both the state of Florida and the state of Maryland too. So
okay.
They've dug into my entire past, including taxes and everything. So.
Okay, Mr. Ferree?
No.
Okay, Mr. Ferree, have you ever declared bankruptcy?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Good. Glad to get past that. Mr. Ferree, why are you running for this office?
Well, I believe the country has big problems that impact this district and Central Florida. I think our incumbent is not addressing some of those problems. Energy policy and the impact on environment is an issue that is really of significance to me. I see no hope that our incumbent will address that issue, but there are many others as well. I have been a public servant in the past in elected office, and I tend to sort of raise my hand when I think there's a job that needs to be done, and it looked to me like, at least prior to Shayan stepping up, it looked like nobody was going to step up in this race, so I decided to do it.
Okay, Mr. Modarres.
Having spent the last several years being a civil rights litigation attorney and representing a number of people that both the public have heard about and some that the public haven't heard about, I think there are a lot of social justice issues that are particularly concerning to me. Namely equal rights for the LGBT community, women's rights, comprehensive immigration reform, protecting the Affordable Care Act, which I am actually a success story of. So a number of issues that I think, like Mr. Ferree said, the incumbent has not addressed. In fact, he's come out and voted against these important issues. And I want to go to Washington, D.C. and fight for people like I have been in Central Florida, but just on a much larger scale now.
Well, you both talked about some important issues, but what would be your top priority if you were elected to office, Mr. Modarres?
I think just the top priority would be fighting for people, and that encompasses a number of issues for me, namely the Affordable Care Act, which I mentioned, comprehensive immigration reform, women's rights, raising the minimum wage, a lot of issues that affect the middle class that Dan Webster has not addressed, and like I said, he's come out against. So namely comprehensive immigration reform. He came out for it when it was beneficial for him. Now he's back to being against it again. These are particular issues that are important to me. I think they're important to the American people and have not been addressed by either Daniel Webster or the other extremists in Washington, D.C. So I hope to change that when I'm elected.
Same question to you, Mr. Ferree.
Well, a national energy policy that would impact Florida, we have to make a serious effort to transition away from fossil fuels, and that's kind of an area of expertise for me, I think. And I would definitely initiate development of policy in that regard. But there are a lot of other issues too. I think economic inequality is an issue that has to be addressed in this country. The gap in income and wealth has gotten extreme. I think the conversation on taxes has been totally dominated by people like Grover Norquist, and the Republicans in Congress, including Daniel Webster, are responsive to people like him and not responsive to the voters. And so that's probably the second issue for me, but there are a number of others as well. But those are the two that I see as really drivers at this point.
You mentioned taxes. Are you in favor of tax reform? And if so, do you favor some of the plans such as flat tax or the fair tax?
No. I think we need tax reform, but it needs to be aimed at reducing the tax burden at the bottom of the economic pile and increasing the tax burden at the top by some extent. I wrote a tax proposal and published it on my Facebook site today. I call it an outrageous tax proposal. And I would cut payroll taxes, FICA taxes by 1/3, cut the rates by 1/3, and make up that revenue in other places. But all that money would go to the roughly bottom 80% of the income structure, the worker structure, income structure, which would just have a lot of benefits. But I called it outrageous because I was hoping somebody would look at it and tell me it was crazy. And it's a radical departure because it calls for offsetting roughly 1/3 of $1 trillion of tax cuts with a carbon tax and a tax on high frequency trading, for example, financial transactions, and eliminating or modifying the cap on income subject to payroll taxes. So it's neutral, revenue neutral, but it distributes the income towards the lower end where it really needs to be. You know, from an economic stimulus standpoint, from a fairness standpoint, from long-term economic health standpoint.
Mr. Modarres, where do you stand on tax reform?
I think the first and foremost thing we need to do is to reform the tax code. We need to simplify it, and I think this president has come out in favor of simplifying the tax code and eliminating a lot of the loopholes that exist right now. But I share a lot of the sentiments that Mr. Ferree mentioned. I do think that the top wealthiest people in America need to pay their fair share, which they haven't done. Things like capital gains are particularly troubling for me. So I do want to first and foremost look at the tax code, simplify it, and also enact a policy of tax reform where the wealthiest Americans also pay their fair share, because I don't believe it's fair or equitable for hardworking Americans to foot the bill while the wealthiest keep getting richer.
And this is a question for both of you. What is that fair share? Mr. Ferree, Daniel Patrick Moynihan proposed something similar to yours, idea, a reduction of Social Security and payroll taxes back in '86, and didn't get anywhere with his fellow Democrats. But anyway, define fair. Give me a percentage for high income earners.
I can't put a number on it specifically. I just think that we need to take a look at it, and we need to really reform the tax code where the wealthiest don't keep getting richer and keep increasing the wage gap and income gap between the wealthiest Americans and the hardworking Americans who keep footing the bill. Last fall, I saw a government shutdown that cost the American people $24 billion at a time when hardworking Americans are working every day to dig ourselves out of a hole that we didn't create. And I think that's just inequitable, and I would do everything I can to reduce that income gap.
That's a really hard question, because you're saying, I think you're saying, okay, what should the highest income tax bracket be? And I don't know what the answer is, but I know that we should try to get back to closer to where we were in 1968 or 1970 or somewhere in that time frame in terms of the distribution of income and distribution of wealth. We really have gone to an extreme not seen since 1928 or something like it. You may or may not be familiar with the Thomas Piketty book, Capital in the 21st Century. He documents, where we are now on a historical basis, and we really are in an extreme. So we need to set a target, and I think the target is probably somewhere in the late 60s, somewhere around there. And it's a huge task. There's no simple solution to a complex problem like this. But one of the reasons I propose this outrageous tax proposal is it is very, very simple and very easy to understand. Cut the payroll tax rate by 1/3. So instead of a 15% net burden on labor, 7.5% from the employee, 7.5% from the employer, you take that burden down from 15% total down to 10% total. It's a huge movement of money down into that lower end. The solutions have to be relatively simple, I think. But I mean, I'm not kidding myself to think that a freshman congressman's going to go to Washington and change the tax structure and change the distribution of wealth in this country in 2 years. But you need to take incremental steps, and you have to do it with things that are simple and understandable and have some curb appeal. And I'm hoping that that's what that idea will do eventually.
So if you cut the payroll tax by a third, how would you finance Social Security and Medicare?
Well, you have to dedicate the revenue to Social Security and Medicare. And that's the high-risk part of my idea, is that I absolutely believe in the value of Social Security and Medicare. That has to be protected. So it's a little bit risky in suggesting cutting the funding source. But I think, well, why couldn't you devote a different revenue source to that purpose? And that's what I would propose: the carbon taxes, tax on financial transactions. The financial transactions tax would slow down this abuse that we witnessed on Wall Street. And that abuse is partly responsible, I think, for the extreme concentration of wealth. Wealth that, by the way, is not circulating. The Federal Reserve has been pushing money into our system, and that money accumulates and it doesn't get invested. And one of the reasons is that it's accumulating in Wall Street, and one of the ways to deal with that problem is to make the whole speculation part of the markets less attractive. That's a long-winded answer. I apologize, but
that's all right. Mr. Modarres, have you held political office before?
I have not.
And have you run for political office?
I have not.
Okay. You are choosing to run for Congress, which is in the hierarchy of offices, is near the top. Why have you chosen to do that and not run for, say, a local government office?
Sure, and that's a question that I get asked a lot. I genuinely believe that I can fight for people on a much larger scale than local politics. I think local politics are very important, so voting for judges, public defender, state attorney, city commissioner, county commissioner, all those things are very important, but I personally believe that I could fight for people on a much larger scale. I have a good grasp on the issues. I know what the American people want to see enacted in Washington, D.C., and that's why I'm running for United States Congress, because what we're seeing now is a record number of millionaires in Washington, D.C., and what you're seeing is it being more, increasingly, congressmen being increasingly more detached from the people that they represent. So United States representatives are supposed to represent the people, not special interests and lobby groups. They're not supposed to go to Washington, D.C. and look ahead to the next primary election or the next big campaign check. They're supposed to really put the people ahead, listen to their constituents, and fight for them. And I think that's what I'll do in Washington, D.C., and that's why I'm running.
What would you tell folks, voters who might be skeptical about your leadership credentials? What would you point to, since you don't have other political office to point to?
I've spent several years in the Central Florida area fighting for people, standing on the front lines, fighting for justice. Me personally taking on police departments and law enforcement agencies with teams of lawyers just by myself, fighting for justice for my clients. The people that relate to me and my message resonates with know that I've been on the front lines for several years when I didn't stand anything to gain from it. A lot of cases that people wouldn't have even heard about. I just recently represented a homeless man up in Sanford who got tased in the back of the head the day after the Zimmerman verdict. We were able to recover a large sum from the city of Sanford and the Sanford Police Department in that case, and that's a case that a lot of lawyers in the area probably wouldn't have taken on just because it wasn't financially worth their time, or they didn't think there was any merit to that claim. But I take great pride in representing these types of people in Central Florida, and I hope to continue it on a larger scale in Washington.
Just to follow up on that, most people seem to think that there is just no compromise in Washington. Neither side would be willing to compromise. So while you've been out on the front lines, is there an example where you've compromised, or you're just, there on behalf of the client? Because I think people might be looking for someone who could seek accommodation.
I compromise day in and day out, and that's part of your job as an attorney. So when you represent your client, a lot of times you need to reach across the aisle, whether it be the state attorney or defense counsel. You need to reach across the aisle sometimes and come to a real solution for your client. Put your client's interests, first and foremost, and reach across the aisle and come to a real solution with the opposing side, and get the best outcome for your client. And that's what I analogize. Fighting for people on a federal level in Washington, D.C. is the people that I represent, my constituents, are my clients. And I'm going to Washington, D.C. to put them first. And, if that requires me to reach across the aisle and work with people on the opposite side, Republicans or non-party affiliations, that's what I'll do. I'm going to put the people ahead of lobbyists and special interest groups.
Mr. Ferree, you mentioned that you have been a public official before. I believe you were on the Eustis City Council for a term?
That's true. I was a city commissioner in Eustis for 4 years.
Okay. Any other political
experience? It's kind of ancient history now, but I was a school board member when my kids were growing up. I was 7 years on a local school board in New Hampshire. And I was chairman of the school board for a couple years. Excuse me. I was a contract negotiator for the school district, negotiating a teacher's contract. In fact, I did that 3 times. And I had elected office, a different elected office too. I was, I was an airline pilot for 30 years. I was a member of the Airline Pilots Association. I was an elected council chairman for my crew base, and so I was elected by my peers who knew me well, and re-elected. And was served until the company closed the pilot base. But it's a political office. It's the same process. It's the same process whether it's a school board or a city commission or a union that elects members to serve a governing board. And I assume it's a similar process in Washington. Of course, in Washington, it's the big league, and there's huge money. My experience in politics, there's never been any money. So that part's different, but the human part is the same, and I think I have pretty good credentials on that part, so good experience.
What is the biggest hurdle to economic recovery in the 10th District, Mr. Modarres, and how would you go about resolving that issue?
Economic recovery? I think what you're seeing in Central Florida is the remnants of predatory loans being given out, a lot of people being put out of their homes in Central Florida. You see a lot of workers who are working minimum wage, so obstruction in Washington, D.C. in regards to raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. All these types of things, I think, contribute to economic recovery. Also, things like comprehensive immigration reform. That would create tax revenue, and some estimate that it would cut our deficit by $900 billion. So there's a lot of things that we can enact in Washington, D.C. that would help America as a whole, but also people in Florida's 10th District.
So you would be in favor of increasing the federal minimum wage?
Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Ferree?
I have to agree with most of that. I'm not sure about the number you gave for impact on the deficit in terms of comprehensive immigration reform. I believe it would be a positive impact. As far as economic recovery in Central Florida, though, a different aspect of it is I believe we don't have, at least parts of the district, don't have a diverse economic base. We're working on that. And certainly the city of Orlando has a more diverse economic base than Lake County, where I came from. For too long it was build houses and bring retirees to Florida and then take care of them. So it was home building and health care. The parks, the vacation, leisure travel. So I believe systematically developing a more diverse economy is very important. I believe Sunrail is an important element of that developing a more diverse economy, and I think that's going to work over the next, the next 10 years. I think that's going to be an integral part of it. But, specific steps to recover the economy, and I agree with Shayan, we're still recovering from the recession, the housing collapse recession. I think we're still recovering from that.
Do you agree with his comment that people who defaulted on their mortgages did through because of predatory lending?
Well, it was certainly a factor. I mean, my personal experience was being fairly comfortable is an overstatement, but I was feeling fairly secure in my personal financial situation. I got really hard hit by that collapse of real estate values. Both real estate, I have a commercial building and my personal residence. And this hit me personally at the same time my former employer went bankrupt and took a pension plan down with it. So I identify with people that got hit really hard with this economic collapse. And predatory lending was certainly a factor in it. Who you actually blame for that, I don't know, because it was such a widespread phenomenon, that expectation of continuous appreciation in real estate values. Where you place the blame, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. It's just that when I think of predatory lending, I think about payday lenders and that sort of thing. I don't think about mortgage companies and based upon predictions, and people were hurt, but
I remember in 1999 or 2002 or somewhere in that time frame watching CNBC and seeing these advertisements for mortgages zero down and with a cashback. I mean, it was really crazy stuff going on, but it was mainstream. I mean, I don't think of a little lending operation next door to a convenience store with the bars and the windows where they cash paychecks. I don't think that's the kind of predatory lending. I don't think that's what Shayan was talking about.
I wanted to circle back. I didn't get an opportunity to ask you about the raising of the federal minimum wage, Mr. Ferree.
I think it should be raised immediately, and I think 1010 is a bottom number.
Just to circle back on that, there are some estimates specifically by the Economic Policy Institute that raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour would give something like 27.8 million people a pay increase in America. A lot of those people being right here in Florida's 10th district. We're seeing a lot of minimum wage workers working for the amusement parks, Disney, Universal, the hospitality industry around here. So I think raising the minimum wage would have a significant impact on Florida's 10th district.
You mentioned comprehensive immigration reform. What about the current crisis on the border? Congress seems to be deadlocked in how to properly respond to it. What would you be in favor of if you were sitting in the U.S. Capitol now? What should be done?
I think what you're seeing is the highlight of why comprehensive immigration reform is needed and why the current immigration system is broken and mismanaged. I think it's very tragic what's happening on the border, what's happening to these kids, and me specifically, I would support comprehensive immigration reform that would completely overhaul the current system, but would also basically be consisted of two different elements. Number one, the opportunity for these undocumented citizens, human beings, to earn lawful permanent resident status, also coupled with a fair pathway to full United States citizenship, because I think one without the other does us no good and would essentially create a legal underclass, which we can't have. I think both of those are needed in any comprehensive immigration reform bill that comes out of the House. I think Joe Garcia put forth H.R. 15, which effectively accomplishes that task and is basically the House version of the Senate bill that passed with bipartisan support last summer. So I think it's extremely important that we at least put that bill to the House floor for an up or down vote, which we haven't seen yet.
Mr. Ferree.
Well, there's two things. I mean, I totally agree that there's need for comprehensive immigration reform. I think it's both stupid and unfair our immigration laws now. We have a large body of young, energetic eager Americans who don't have citizenship, because probably maybe their parents came here to work and they didn't have proper documents. So you have that group of people that we need to be contributors, productive contributors to our society, and we're also treating them unfairly. But the immediate problem of the kids at the border, that's really, I don't know what the emergency response is, other than that you give them food and shelter, you take care of them like they were your own children, and you give them a process to either reunite with family that they have here, or a process to get them back to where they came from in a way that they're safe when they get back. I don't know, the one reason given for this influx of undocumented minors is that they are afraid at home. There's gang warfare and they're in danger at home. Well, I think you have to acknowledge that, and you have to find out how real that is, and you don't want to send them back to that if there's real danger. But it's a tough, it's a tough problem, and I confess I don't have a good answer about what to do immediately.
Let's move to Obamacare. Should Congress leave Obamacare alone, repeal it, or revise it, Mr. Modarres?
I think it's made significant progress in the healthcare industry. I mentioned that I am a success story of the Affordable Care Act. So in November of 2012, I was hospitalized for about 6 days. I didn't have health insurance because I was kicked off my father's insurance plan. I was hospitalized and came out. The first thing I did was apply for health insurance. Of course, I was denied because I had a pre-existing condition. I'm a success story of the Affordable Care Act. I know it works because it worked personally for me, and it's worked for millions of other Americans. And that's why I think we need to protect the significant progress it's made. It's not perfect, but we're getting there. And I don't think repealing it or defunding it is the solution, because you hear many Republicans come out in favor of repealing the act or defunding it completely, which is essentially repealing it. But what you don't hear is their alternative to it. They don't put forth an alternative as to how we can fix the broken healthcare system in America. And I think, if we have an act in place that is making significant progress for millions and millions of Americans, especially here in Florida, I think we need to leave it alone and work on improving it rather than completely repealing the law.
Well, you mentioned that it's not perfect. What needs to be fixed or tweaked in your opinion?
Me personally, I would like to see us move more towards a single-payer system. I think that's beneficial, but I think when they passed the law, they took what they could get at that moment, and I think it made significant progress. They took what they could get, but I would like to see us move more towards a single-payer system.
Mr. Ferree?
Well, here we go again. I agree with him. So, but. No, I think what we have is a good first step, and we've got millions of people that are getting coverage now, and they didn't have it. And every one of us has a personal story, either of their own or of a close family member or a friend who was really in jeopardy because of a lack of access to health care. So, good first step, but we still have millions of people who don't have it. So that's an improvement that we have to figure that out somehow. But I also agree that we need to eventually have a single-payer system. In addition to the fact that it's a quality of life issue for Americans not having access to health care, it's a major, major economic issue too. We spend over 17.5% of our GDP. Our competitors spend 10 or 12% of GDP. Japan, it's even less than that. We overspend on a couple of other things too, but it's a self-inflicted wound or a self-inflicted handicap if we overspend compared to the other economies that we're competing with. So if we're smart, we better figure out a better and lower cost way. I believe a single-payer healthcare system will be lower cost, and will bring everybody in, so everybody will have coverage.
I got to follow up on that. When there was a Democratic Congress, which was responsible for passing the Affordable Care Act, they couldn't even get through a public option in the Affordable Care Act. isn't it the idea of a single payer system? Isn't that kind of the ultimate windmill to be tilting at if you go off to Congress?
Perhaps. I mean, the reason the Affordable Care Act was so difficult to pass, and the reason it's a bit of a kludge, is there are huge established economic interests that don't want it to happen. I mean, I saw a three-way fight a long time ago. You have a fight between the lawyers and the doctors or the health care facilities and the insurance companies.
The pharmaceutical companies.
Well, pharmaceuticals too. But I mean, it's all of that is that 17.5% of GDP. And so everybody wants to try and protect the turf. And I totally understand your question. But if you don't start chipping away at the problem, I don't think you ever solve it. And I do believe that the American public is going to come to the realization that the Affordable Care Act is a win overall. They're going to say, this is a good thing, don't take it away. So the conversation will be different the next time, I believe. And so, single payer system, it'll be a fight, but I don't think it's one that we shouldn't take.
Mm-hmm. Okay, same question to you, Mr. Modarres, since you said that you were also interested in a single payer system.
I think right now I agree with Mr. Ferree. It is a money fight, but what you're seeing is that it's made significant progress for millions of Americans. For seniors, it's cut prescription drug costs by something like $9 billion. For women, it's providing preventative care. It no longer views rape or incest as a pre-existing condition. It's made significant progress for young people who are able to be under their parents' insurance plans until they're age 26. So it would have helped me when I was coming out of college. It's made significant progress, and I think we need to take what we have right now, but we can work towards a more better solution, which is a single payer system, I believe.
Well, speaking of big parts of our GDP, should we increase or cut defense spending or leave it alone? And we'll start with Mr. Ferree.
Okay. We spend too much. You know, I said there are big items we spend too much on. It's healthcare, it's national security spending, and it's energy. And we are at a significant disadvantage with the other world economies that we compete with. Defense spending, you know, I had 11 years in the Navy. I'm a military veteran, and my entire career as an airline pilot, I had half the time I was flying, I had a guy in the right seat who was still in a Air Force Reserve or a Navy Reserve or a Marine Corps Reserve unit, and I heard what's going on in the military. I understand what our military commitments are and our, where we spend our money. I think we spend too much. I mean, case in point, and this is risky to name a particular weapon system or project, but we're on track to buy 2,400 F-35s, fighters. The last number I saw was $400 billion for the cost of that particular weapon system. As a pilot, former military pilot, I have a little bit of understanding of the whole notion of air combat and how you use a flying machine in a combat situation. I am somewhat skeptical of the F-35 as a viable platform. And I've had people tell me, I had a conversation with a fellow who works for Lockheed the other night. He says it's absolutely fantastic, incredible what this thing can do. It's also incredible what my iPhone can do and what the latest app can do compared to what we had available 20 years ago. And we have B-52s that are still flying. They're 60 years old. We have B-1s that are still flying that are 30 years old. B-2s that are 20 years old. They're fantastic airplanes, but are they really a realistic tool going forward the way technology is changing as it is? So long-winded, I apologize, but it's a huge expenditure. If you count all of our national security expenditures, it works out to about $1 trillion a year. That's not the number you're going to read when you look for the national defense budget, you'll find a number that I don't know is $600 or $700 billion or something like, significantly less than the total. But it's $1 trillion a year. Nobody else spends at that level, and I don't think we can sustain it either. So I really believe that over time we have to make sensible reductions in our defense spending.
Where would you make cuts other than the F-35 you mentioned?
Well, I don't know. I was a P-3 pilot in the Navy. Our mission was to hunt submarines, and we would fly out around, over the ocean, and we'd try to find submarines. And this was a primitive version of the airborne equipment, but the submarine always had such a huge advantage. And I always thought that if that submarine wanted to knock out an aircraft carrier, it would be so easy to do. So, long roundabout again, I question the importance and the long-term usefulness of our carrier fleet, or at least the numbers that we have. There is a mission there in terms of projecting power, but I think it needs to be re-examined. We have a fleet of new ballistic missile submarines, or maybe not ballistic missile. I think they maybe are attack submarines, but there's a fleet of new, I believe it's Virginia-class submarines that's under construction. I think every one of those should be looked at because it's huge money. I think once they get started, they assume a momentum of their own, and they're really, really hard to stop. But I think they need to be re-examined.
And let me give you an opportunity to answer this same question.
Sure, I agree with most of what Mr. Ferree said. I think everything needs to be re-examined, but the approach I would take would be a more overarching approach. I think what you're seeing now is a lot of spending overseas, which is a result of armed conflict being a first option rather than a last resort. So I think the bigger answer would be to kind of extend the policies of this president and Secretary Kerry, and that diplomacy is the first option. We try to reach diplomatic solutions with nations. We try to avoid armed conflict where possible and have it be a last resort. And I think what you're seeing now is the results of a lot of spending basically as a result of reckless involvement overseas. So I think what I bring is a unique perspective to the United States Congress. My background as an Iranian American, I have a fundamental understanding of the deeper issues between the United States and Iran, which date back decades. And I think I would be able to better navigate the United States foreign policy in that respect.
Could I follow on that? Follow on with that? Yeah, I totally agree, Mr. Modarres. I call you Shayan, but I should call you Mr. Modarres in this inning.
You can call me Shayan.
Okay, but one of the reasons we have defense spending at the level we have it is because of the other problem, our excessive spending and our consumption of energy. I don't know what the number is, but you could make the case that 1/3 of our defense spending is for protection of access to fossil fuels, protection of the sea lanes that allow us access to the fossil fuels, protection of the fields themselves. I mean, certainly a lot of history in Iran and Iraq, all about access to fossil fuels. So these are intertwined problems, but again, you have to overcome the inertia and the established interests that want to keep the game going as long as they can.
Would you, in advocating defense cuts, would you advocate cutting a program that would lead to losses within the 10th district, employment losses?
Well, that's really tough. Yes. Mm-hmm. If it's a program that we shouldn't have as a nation and it results in job losses locally, that's a really tough one for any politician, because we have defense related activity in probably every county in the country, and you have to find something else for your people to do. But I don't think it's right to refuse to make reductions in defense spending just because we're making something here that the Department of Defense pays for.
Same question.
That's a tough question. You're basically asking us to weigh the American people's interest versus the interests of the people in the 10th district. That's something that I would have to take a very close look at. I think, like Mr. Ferree said, there is defense spending in almost every county in the country, and no representative would want their cuts to come from their district. That would mean jobs lost and revenue lost, and you know, hardworking Americans falling on tough times again. So that's something that I would take a hard look at. And if it is something that's wasteful and would benefit the American people as a whole, it's something that I would take a very serious look at.
I think we're getting close to the end of our time here. I want to ask each of you in turn, since this is a race, a primary with 3 candidates, why voters should choose you among the 3. What is it about you that should lead voters to pick you? And let's start with Mr. Ferree.
Well, one thing I bring to the table is experience. I have been in elected government. I have I believe a broad perspective gained through life and work, and I have a mission, and that mission is long-term economic health for this area, for the state of Florida. The whole problem of a smarter energy policy going forward, it's dealing with the economics, it's dealing with the environmental future for those who come after us. Here in Florida, we know that climate change is going to raise the water level, and we know that folks are going to move from South Florida to Central Florida as that happens. So I have a mission of raising awareness and hopefully writing policy, or getting the process started, writing policy towards dealing with that issue, the cost of energy and its impact on the climate.
Same question. Short answer is I'm a fighter. A vote for me means you're getting a fighter on your side, and I think the voters of District 10 know that. They've seen me on the front lines fighting for people, fighting for justice over the last several years in Central Florida, and I will continue that in Washington, D.C. What you get with me is someone who is willing to go to Washington and be vocal and outspoken and be relentless about the things he believes in and the things that his constituents believe in, regardless of the costs. I'll be, very vocal and outspoken, not look forward to the next election, not look forward to the next campaign check, but really spend the next 2 years putting people ahead, fighting for them. And if, after those 2 years they decide they want me back, I'd be glad to serve again. If not, I'd be glad to, go back to practicing law and fighting for people in the civil rights field. But what you get with me is a fighter who's willing to go up and do whatever it takes to put the people of District 10 first again.
Any concluding questions, Jim?
No, I think that should do it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.